les travaux. Donc, Quinn, qui est historien, spécialisé dans l'histoire intellectuelle et mondiale, avec un accent particulier donc, sur le néolibéralisme, les questions de mondialisation, et qui est donc professeur d'histoire internationale à l'université de Boston, même s'il est canadien. On connaît son ouvrage Globalists, The End of Empire and the Birth of Neoliberalism de 2018, qui analysait la réaction des penseurs néolibéraux à la décolonisation, transformation de l'ordre mondial, et qui donc revient avec ce livre Crack-Up Capitalism, qu'on aurait presque pu traduire par le capitalisme aussi, de la fragmentation, pas hydraulique, quoi, que drill, baby drill, ça. Mais voilà, c'est une autre fragmentation que celle des sols dont il va nous parler, et donc cette fois en anglais, et on le remercie infiniment dans un agenda particulièrement chargé pour ces passages français à l'occasion de la traduction de son livre donc, sur le capitalisme de l'Apocalypse. Donc là aussi pour 35 minutes. Merci encore.
Yeah. Well, thank you, everybody, and thank you for listening to my English. I apologize. I'm from the wrong part of Canada. Vancouver Island. We don't have any francophones there, as far as I know. Okay, so my talk will be introducing basically my recent book, which is very recent in French. It just came out last week. The confluence of events has meant that I have become the designated explainer-in-chief about Musk and Trump for the French public in the last 48 hours, and have done many media things and 3 radio shows, and I'm quite exhausted. So pardon me if I start to fade off or ramble. I will try to concentrate. My talk, I think, will be not on the far right as precisely as Michelle's and Estelle's were, but more of the broader context within which the recent wave of the far right has begun to emerge. And I'm going to do this by way of a kind of revision of what I think are some of the commonplace ways we understand the world since 1989, since the end of the Cold War. So I think there are basically 3 assumptions about the world since 1989. And in the course of this talk, I hope to call all 3 of them into question. The first is what I would call the supranational thesis. So an idea that the main story since the fall of the Berlin Wall was a kind of creation of new institutions that sit above or on top of the nation. The European Union, NAFTA, the World Trade Organization, the whole net of multilateral and bilateral trade agreements through which capitalism operates. I think if many people were asked, they would say, what was the big deal after 1989? They would say, well, the construction of a new institutional architecture to make global capitalism, function more efficiently. I think another thesis that we use, even without thinking about it, and sometimes openly, is the much maligned end of history thesis. So this idea that after 1989, liberal democracy, capitalist democracy was sort of the last game in town, the last man standing. And there was a general agreement about the mutual complementary qualities of capitalism and democracy. They might be a kind of uneasy marriage sometimes, as Martin Wolf would describe it, but more or less they were still remain married. And this was the primary kind of storyline. The third argument I think we take for granted is that even though there were new multinational institutions, the nation state is still kind of the final resting place of society. There's no real movement to one global borderless community. It's still the natural thing to do for people to form into nation states, and this is probably the way it will remain for the foreseeable future. So how will I challenge this set of ideas? Partially, I'll do so by referring to some of the main categories I used in my 2 most recent books, both of which are now out on Soy, this one a couple of years ago, A Globalist, and the other one just last week, as I said. So Globalists, and the reason I put the covers up is the covers kind of capture the thesis in a way. The story of Globalists was about the emergence of a seemingly contradictory process in the 20th century. On the one hand, you have a more and more united and interdependent world economy. On the other hand, you have a world of many more small nation states. So how does the world economy manage the problem of political diversity? I talk about that problem in the book, the way that my characters do, which is the challenge of balancing a world of dominium, that is a world of property, goods, and things on the one hand, and a world of imperium, or of people, governments, and states on the other. So for my neoliberal intellectuals and for many other people, the challenge of global economic governance is how to make sure that imperium, the world of states, does not obstruct too much the world of dominium, or the free movement of capital, the ability to invest anywhere in the world, the ability to feel secure about your investment once it's there, the ability to take your money out when you want to, put it in when you want to. How can you come up with an institutional fix or solution so that states more or less operate on behalf of capital? Loosely speaking, they don't break the rules too much. So this is opposition in simple terms of a world where there's a globe, the world of the economy, and then a world of many, many nations. The neoliberal intellectuals that I study felt quite excited by the end of the 20th century because they thought that the WTO in particular was a kind of institutional realization of a fix or a solution for the problem of dominium and imperium. Now, finally, you had something, ideally speaking, like one law for the world economy. You had a kind of a court, an appellate body you could take your disputes to, and there was enforceability. So if you're breaking the law of the world economy, you can have measures placed against you to punish you until you stop breaking the rule of the world economy. The way that this arrangement is almost always described is as a so-called Ulysses Pact. So states agree to bind themselves, tie their hands to the mast, to prevent the siren songs of the protectionists, the socialists, the special interests from taking the ship of globalization and smashing it into the rocks. So this is the kind of promise of something like the WTO and the promise of international economic law, that the pre-commitment that states would agree to would allow for the smooth functioning of world economic order. In 2016, as we all know, there was much discourse about the end of this particular arrangement. Brexit, Trump, AfD, other far-right parties that Estelle helpfully was reminding us of, seem to be untying their hands from the mast and about to sort of smash the ship of globalization into the rocks. This is the story we were told again and again in the financial press and elsewhere. The pendulum has swung from the world back to the nation. States have forgotten their commitments, and now they're going to stand in the way of the smooth functioning of global order. And we are now in a world of, as the IMF calls it, geoeconomic fragmentation. Whereas before there had been something smoothly functioning, now the machinery was broken, the mechanism was broken in some ways. At the time, I found this a deeply unhelpful way of describing what was happening. And one of the reasons that I found it unhelpful is that I didn't think we were actually just going back to the world of the 1930s, even though that's what we were told again and again by the Martin Wolfs of the world, that this is just a step backwards, the pendulum has swung, and watch out, because if you have tariff walls, that means that fascism is not far behind. If you break the rule of the world economy, then you're also opening the door to darker and darker forces. So we need to beware. But to me, looking at the Brexit campaign, looking at much of Trump's campaign, this wasn't a kind of a backlash against global capitalism. It was much more like a front lash accelerating many of the dynamics of global capitalism and accelerating many of the forms of competition that had been that had emerged in the 1990s. So how to talk about this when we're only given two options, globalization or nationalism? We were in a trap, a kind of an analytical dead end, and we needed to sort of figure out ways to think our way out of this unhelpful binary. So being a historian, I sort of tried to take a long view and ask myself, okay, what has changed in the 20th century so that the threat of the 1930s is not the same as the threat of the 2010s? Because at some level, we're still dealing with the same problem, which is there are more and more states, and yet there's ever more of a single world economy. It's not a problem that has gone away. But we have had, I think, three different moments where this problem has spiked and become particularly obvious. This is a graph of, the emergence of new sovereign states in the world system. I actually had to make it myself, which is very hard for me to do. I don't know how to do these things. And I was surprised that such a graph didn't exist yet. Yet, as I thought about it, I realized it doesn't exist because these three moments are actually rarely thought about together. This first moment, the end of the First World War, the end of land-based empires, Ottoman Empire, Russian Empire, Austro-Hungarian Empire. What do we call that? Sort of the Wilsonian moment, the moment of the breakup of empires of some kind. But that is dealt with in its own isolation. The second moment, the 1960s, that one big spike is the year of Africa, when many sub-Saharan African countries gained independence. We have a name for that, decolonization. That's usually that moment is described as the end of the saltwater overseas European empires. Third moment is, of course, the breakup of the Soviet Union and Yugoslavia. What is that called? The end of the Cold War, the dissolution of the Soviet bloc. But rarely do you think about these three things as presenting comparable problems for world order. I think they did. And each time it was this problem of new nations potentially threatening the smooth functioning of a world where dominium should always have power over imperium. The Globalist book already kind of told the story that connected the interwar moment to the 1960s moment. There are many similarities between the problems presented by a new Czechoslovakia and a new Ghana. They both threatened to step over that limit and start turning property into national property, privileging citizens, and so on. The 1990s, you could say, were part of the same progression, that the World Trade Organization and international investment law was also there to kind of bind nations and keeping them on track. But that wouldn't really help us understand then why we seem to be suddenly dealing with a new political problem by the early 21st century. However, what I started to think about was that by this third spike, we are no longer just dealing with the globe and the nation. The nation actually isn't the sort of end point for economic organization. By the 1970s and 1980s, the nation has been joined by a new piece of political geography, which is called the zone, the special economic zone, the export processing zone, which exists only in a few places until the 1980s, and then really takes off. And now, most countries in the world have some form of special economic zone, which means inside the national territory, small place is ring-fenced, has a different set of laws, different set of taxation, different set of labor regulations, designed to induce capital from outside to put their money there instead of somewhere else. So in other words, we weren't just left with a political geography of the world and the nation, but we have a kind of a third term here that becomes quite important, which is the category of the zone that, as you can see in a map there of the world's economic zones, here's a bigger version, perforates the world, punches holes in nations in all kinds of ways that become very important in the first instance for sites of investment, magnets for attracting state subsidies, but also for, in the case of China, for recommodifying land and turning steady employment contracts into completely precarious labor environments. The Shenzhen model, itself borrowed from Hong Kong, is the model by which China opens up its economy, and that vision of development through zoning is then taken up as the kind of standard model by which poorer nations now have to attract both foreign aid funding, lending, and investment capital. So this might seem, on the one hand, like a completely different story to the story of far right that brings us here today. But in what remains of my time, I'm going to argue that the stories are much more similar and have a lot more to do with each other than we might think. My argument is that if we kind of put on the zone glasses, then we can see things about the world economy, but also about the radicalization of politics on the right that would otherwise not be visible. So I'm going to use a couple of examples here to talk about what I mean. One example is to talk about what China is as a kind of economic alternative, as an economic threat from the American point of view, and from the European point of view, a kind of mixture of promise and threat, opportunity. China, often described in Canada, I was going to say in the United States, as in a form of state capitalism, a kind of centrally driven nationalist push for often described economic dominance or even world dominance, is actually better understood as a kind of a logistical empire, if anything, that is not operating kind of smoothly to try to dominate one market after the other, as much as they are taking over key points of infrastructure and investing in them, making partnerships with local governments and local actors to control choke points in the world economy that are most effective and useful for them. As they do so, they're often repeating the footprints of the British Empire that preceded them. Poetically, they're even often signing 99-year leases of the exact same kind that the British forced the Chinese to sign for Hong Kong's new territories in 1899. Now China has a 99-year lease on the Hambantota port in Sri Lanka, for example. So in the first instance here, we can see that zones are a way that China is extending its own foreign influence in a way that is not global. They're not making a new WTO, so there can be one law for the world economy. That's not actually the Chinese way of empire. It never has been. But operating through a kind of tributary system is actually the Chinese form of foreign economic policy, and now it's happening through deep water harbors and military bases and logistics centers. Another more obvious and direct example is the British Conservative Party, which in the late 1970s had a kind of come to Jesus or aha moment about Hong Kong, which was that this colony in the other side of the world should actually be the model for transforming the British economy domestically. And as I describe in the book, Geoffrey Howe, Margaret Thatcher's first Chancellor of the Exchequer, falls in love with the Hong Kong model, and in the first Thatcher budget in 1980, creates a series of free ports and enterprise zones, which are described openly as attempts to make Hong Kongs inside of inner cities inside of Britain. What do? You take a small area, you remove local government control because local councils were almost uniformly labor operated at that time. You give lower taxes, you give tax incentives, you give tax holidays, you give federal, or you give public funds transferred straight in. And these things were forms of corporate welfare, basically, would have bankrupted the country if they tried to do too many of them. But they had one big success, which is Canary Wharf, of course. And now they have something that's at the level of the city of London in size and in terms of financial services, which they can point to and say, look, we did it. We made a new Hong Kong inside of London. Forget the fact that all of our other Hong Kongs didn't work. Forget the fact that since 1980, so this is literally almost the extension of my life, the British Conservative Party still has only one idea about how they can reindustrialize the north of England, which is make a new economic zone. So this is the 2021 budget. It has free ports in almost the same places that Geoffrey Howe put the free ports in 1980. And if you look at, this is Boris Johnson and Rishi Sunak both, they're still using a very similar idea of trying to globalize Britain. Go global was the original slogan for the Brexit campaign before Dominic Cummings changed it to take back control, which was a much better tagline. But this supposedly first example of like a backlash against globalization, a turn inward, a return to economic nationalism is not that whatsoever. It was an attempt to, zone the country to tap into markets outside of the umbrella of EU regulation, which they saw as stifling. So far, they've been just as successful with these free ports as others. Only 6 businesses have signed up altogether in all of the UK free ports. This is from last September. There's a great quote from the Office for Budget Responsibility. It says that it's expected that the impact of free ports on UK GDP will be so small it would be, quote, difficult to discern even in retrospect. It's just like very small, very not able to detect. So this is an example that I want to use of the zone as a kind of policy meme that is not actually effective and yet still colonizes the imagination of a lot of parties on the right. More extreme examples in the United States now include attempts to bring back the company town. So recently, you might have seen that Elon Musk has been given the right to create a new town in Texas where he would write the laws himself for how the municipality would be governed. This is, of course, has a long tradition in the United States. It's how the west of the country was expanded through privately run and owned company towns. Nevada and Texas are at the forefront of this proposition. Closer to home here for you all, if anyone were to ask someone around 2016 or 17 who the poster child of economic nationalism and kind of backlash against globalization 90s style was, they would probably say Viktor Orban. It might be one of the first people they would name. And yet, Orban too has created new special economic zones inside of Hungary to keep specifically South Korean investment in the country as he continues to not withdraw into self-sufficiency in some 1930s throwback way, but actually remain tapped into multiple markets. So playing to the Koreans, the Russians, the Chinese, and Western Europe and the United States. So this is not a kind of deglobalization move. It's actually more of a hyperglobalization misrecognized for social reasons as a withdrawal. One of my favorite examples is Poland under the PIS, which managed to turn the entire country into a special economic zone. So using the kind of exceptions that the later accession states have to continue using policies that for most EU states would be openly against, obviously, competition law, bans on state aid. They're specifically skewing the level playing field at the EU level, and doing so with these rather traditional high globalization modes of zoning technologies. 2 more people you would probably think would be high on the list of who's the face of the populist backlash. One would be Matteo Salvini, who also helped to lead the creation of a series of special economic zones in southern Italy, which were slated, at least intentionally originally by Meloni, to be turned into one single SEZ for the whole Mezzogiorno by the end of last year. I think it's worth looking a bit at her language here, where she said, the development of the economy in southern Italy is a priority for our government. However, we are convinced that this goal must be achieved by abandoning the logic of welfarism, so no more of Michel's parasites, which does not work, and providing opportunities for work and growth and making these areas of the country competitive and attractive for investments and businesses, and doing this by creating SEZs. This is cut and paste from a McKinsey report from the late 1990s. It's cut and paste from the language of a Tony Blair or a Gerhard Schröder. It's the same language, it's the same tools, and yet it's being presented as a kind of rupture with the preceding era. I think we actually need to ask why we're allowing ourselves to be suckered in to this rhetorical switcheroo, we say in English. Putin is also a big zone guy. The biggest zone in the world is the Russian Arctic Free Trade Zone, where they're really innovating. This is where they're bringing back the woolly mammoth. I don't know if anyone's heard about this adventurous bit of economic engineering and genetic engineering in Russia. And more recently, these have now been sold also as like global development projects. So Alabuga Special Economic Zone there in the middle of Russia is bringing in workers from sub-Saharan Africa and, posing with them saying, look, we're creating education and training opportunities for people from poorer countries, assembling drones for the war in Ukraine. Korea is a really interesting example of how the zone can kind of transform over time. So SEZs were originally created along the demilitarized zone, the DMZ, in the early 2000s on a model of kind of Ostpolitik. The idea was South Korean companies would use the cheap labor of North Korea for their products and then slowly bring up the standard of living for North Koreans, and they would begin to see each other as, mutually beneficial instead of enemies, and there would be a kind of Wandel durch Annäherung, as the Germans say, like change through growing closer together, or Wandel durch Handel. That didn't last very long, but the place where the zones have now had a recent revival is as a way of evading sanctions against Russia in the course of the war. And as you can see here, North Korean Special Economic Zone has been revived as sites for transfer of weapons, oil, and more recently, of course, soldiers from North Korea to the conflict in Ukraine. When I gave this exact talk about 5 hours ago at the EU Tax Observatory at the Paris School of Economics, afterwards, a young man came up to me. He said he's a financial investigator, financial crimes investigator, and he said SEZs are being used all over the world to avoid sanctions now, specifically by countries that have been supposedly quarantined from trade. They continue to be the way to keep the trade moving. Dubai offers I think an underappreciated model for how you can use the zoning technology to plug yourself into many kinds of effective global capitalist trade, and also be what I think is the real template for Trumpist politics, much more than 1930s fascism. It's 2025 Dubai, where you have a combination of autocratic rule, hire and fire and deport workforce, speculative real estate investment, high-profile entertainment and sporting events. And in the case of the DP World Overseas Empire, again, a kind of pontillist map of outposts where they're basically operating deep sea harbors and logistics hubs all over the world, often again in the places where the British Empire itself once was. The realities of using the zone offshoring model as a form of bringing back your economy was made clear last year, a couple of years ago, when P&O Shipping, which was one of the big shipping lines, was bought by DP World. And they operate the ferries between parts of the British Isles. One day, they fired their entire workforce. And to the shock of Parliament, they discovered that they were not covered at all by British labor law because they were owned by a Dubai company. The ship was registered in Panama, and it was flagged from Liberia, I think. And they offered to hire back the whole workforce, but at much less than the British minimum wage, because, of course, they now lived in a kind of economic space of legality that was not fixed to the nation itself, but was outsourced in a form of convenience globally. Modi is another example where he's been sort of, India has been late on taking up zoning technologies. There was a wave of doing it internally in the early 2000s, including by communist governments in Bengal that actually turned quite ugly when protesters were trying to stop them. But now they're getting on the logistics and corridor bandwagon, following Dubai and China. As China becomes more of an opponent for the United States, an adversary, India now says, look, we'll do the Belt and Road, but we're friendlier to you than China is. And the most important example of that is the Iran, Middle East, Europe corridor that connects ports in Mumbai through Jebel Ali, which is the sort of original export processing zone in Dubai, through Saudi Arabia, and then importantly through Haifa in Israel. So Haifa is now managed by Adani special economic zones and ports. And people have wondered sometimes why Modi has switched so quickly from the traditional Indian sympathy for the Palestinian people and the Palestinian cause to complete foursquare standing with Israel and not saying a word about Palestine. Well, the fact that the whole globalizing strategy that they're building their future on relies on partnership with Israel and literally managing the port in Haifa is one of the ways, again, the zone glasses help us see supposed far-right nationalism actually just taking another strategy of globalization. Now, I can't let this guy go. People probably recognize Javier Milei, dressed up here as General ANCAP, or General Anarcho-Capitalist. One of the things my book is, the one that's just published, is, I guess, the first intellectual history of anarcho-capitalism, which is an extreme school of thought within libertarianism, which believes you can do away with the state altogether and provide all of the state services you normally would through private contract. So private courts, private police, privately produced money, the state can be removed altogether. Until now, we definitely did not have a head of state who called himself an anarcho-capitalist, but now we do, and I think that presents us with an interesting kind of paradox of interpretation, at least, how someone can call themselves an enemy of the state as such, and yet lead a state, take smiling pictures with the head of research at the IMF, the chief economist of the IMF, I can't remember her name, Gopinath, and then give speeches to rousing applause. You mentioned this too, at the World Economic Forum, praised by the Neil Fergusons of the world. I'm working towards a conclusion here, but I think one of the ways we have to interpret this conundrum of people who don't believe in the state leading states is either they're just hypocrites, and this is just a way to smooth talk your way into power and then get what you want. So old-fashioned political lies and state capture is the ultimate goal. Or there's some idea of a transition from state capture towards something else, some version of state exit, some version of dissolution of the central state. And Murray Rothbard, who is Javier Milei's guru, self-described, prescribed exactly this, that you take over the state to destroy the state. And in the wake of that, as Michelle was saying, the paleo-conservative model of contractual communities at a much smaller level then becomes the new reality. So there are signs of hope for anarcho-capitalists. Mohammed bin Salman has proposed the creation of a private city in Neom, which I'm sure people have heard of. The architect, I'll come back to that in a sec. This is still shocks me every time I see it. But how many people have seen these images before? A couple, but not everyone. So this came out of Netanyahu's office, and it was called the Gaza 2020 I think, 2030 plan, Gaza 2035 plan. This is literally the accompanying images to a proposal for a kind of day after in the Gaza Strip, where it will be a massive free trade zone connected logistically to Neom, which is the city has yet to be built in southwestern Saudi Peninsula. And if you look more closely, you can see it's all, men in traditional golf attire, and then basically parking lots filled with Teslas. So Neom is this, and it accompanies a map that shows how this will all be linked and connected across the Sinai Peninsula. Oops, I thought I had a different slide here, but let me just say about this that the Neom project was built by Zaha Hadid architects, but Zaha Hadid has been dead for years. It's not Zaha Hadid who designed this. It's someone named Patrick Schumacher, a German architect, who is the principal now at Zaha Hadid, who is also an anarcho-capitalist, and who sees his own collaborations, which are many, with China, Hong Kong, Saudi Arabia, and Dubai, as sort of building the infrastructure for what he hopes will be a future stateless society. Whether that happens is now, I think, more of a question than it was 6 months ago because of the close alliances between some of the hyper-libertarians in the tech world and Trump. But what I will provisionally conclude with here is that I think this story helps us undermine 3 of these core consensus points. One, it shows that there never was a sort of a movement only going upward in which nations were being nested inside larger institutions. In fact, all along, there was a functional fragmentation. So the zones worked to make capitalism work more smoothly. They were built in beneath the level of the nation, not just over the level of the nation. Secondly, quite obviously, there has been competing models of non-democratic capitalism, and not just as an ugly threat in the distance, but as the places where French people and British people will choose to go on vacation, i.e. Dubai, which nation branding experts, as I mentioned in the book, in the early 2000s found out when they asked people, what are the places you have the highest opinion of, Europeans, they would say Dubai and Singapore. And if they asked, does the question of democracy have anything to do with your decision? Absolutely not. So these are not, this is not the totalitarian menace on the horizon. These are the glitzy, beautiful places where the rich footballers go to retire and people have a kind of a dream life. So understanding that, making that part of our history of the world since the end of the Cold War, I think is absolutely essential. And then thirdly, there are people who hope that the nation state isn't the end of the story, that there will be something beyond that. Privately governed spaces, startup cities, charter cities, network states is the way it's described by many of the people in Silicon Valley. Once again, this is not a prediction that that will happen, but it's good to keep that in our mental map of sort of political geographies that are floating around and often in the minds of some of the richest people in the world. Okay, I'll leave it at that.
Peut-être qu'on peut prendre tout d'abord quelques questions spécifiquement dirigées vers Quinn, et on va clairement continuer jusqu'à 19h30, et ne pas s'arrêter à 19h, et on pourra ensuite effectivement avoir une discussion plus générale, et évidemment, si vous avez des obligations.
Yeah, I mean...
Can you repeat the question
yes.
by summarizing?
Sure. What do I make of the thesis that we're seeing the end of capitalism itself and it's being replaced by techno-feudalism? The Yanis Varoufakis thesis, in short, right? I mean, this is what he's been saying. I don't know if you saw this. I thought it was fascinating that Steve Bannon is now using the category of techno-feudalism in his fight with the Silicon Valley tech titans for Trump's favor. Steve Bannon last week said that they have techno-feudalism in Silicon Valley. It's an apartheid state, that it's indentured slavery, and that these guys should go back to South Africa. So the temperature is getting very high there. I do think, so one thing I will agree with this thesis about is that I think Elon Musk's own job title at Tesla Do you know what it is? His job title? It's Techno King. He's not the CEO of Tesla. He is the Techno King of Tesla. And I think that's a good self-description, actually, because I don't actually think libertarian is even a helpful way to describe Musk, his own ideology, nor to describe what we're seeing in the United States right now. It is much more like a fusion of certain set of priorities associated with Silicon Valley, with authoritarianism in the person of Donald Trump. But to me, it has not yet transformed the whole field of laws and value creation enough to have ended capitalism, except if you see that in a very narrow, normatively restricted way, or have like transformed the very basis of claims making and that one would assume feudalism would imply. So I'm really skeptical about that description, and I actually think it's disempowering for the left to claim that we have abandoned altogether the previous system into a new one, because that means all other forms of analysis are now anachronistic and debunked. And I think that's more of a personal branding exercise than an actual attempt to deal with the world as it is. Yeah. Oh, yeah. What do I think? What do I think of a genre of writing about the death of neoliberalism? So, I mean, being a historian and a contextualist, intellectual historian, I don't think there's an essence for ideology. So I don't think there is something you could say is like pure neoliberalism across time. I think neoliberalism is a evolving political project. The way I describe it is it's an ongoing project to protect capitalism from democracy. And so the enemies of neoliberalism are different in different decades. In the 1930s, it was fascists and communists. In the 1950s and 60s, it was social democrats that they were more worried about than communists. In the 1990s, and I'm drawing this from the writings of people themselves, it was environmentalists and feminists and anti-racists. The EU looked helpful at one point, and then they got worried about it, and they wanted to get out of the EU. So if you see neoliberalism as a kind of constantly evolving form that often makes strange bedfellows, even AfD in Germany, we haven't talked much about, but this ordo-liberal economist worried about Merkel's bailouts, deciding to work with, neo-Nazi chauvinists, because that was the most effective alliance against what they saw as their primary opponent. So I think if you think about it in terms of that, like an evolving and often radicalizing set of political arguments to defend capitalism, then it can't die any more than any other ideologies die. If you think of it as a particular set of institutional arrangements, let's say the multilateral trade era, then I think you can say those have become progressively more toothless and inconsequential to the everyday operations of capitalism. Obviously, the WTO has not had a functioning appellate body now for almost a decade. So it already is more or less out of commission as the world court for the economy it was hoped to be. So yeah, I mean, I think as an intellectual and a political project, unfortunately, not dead, radicalizing, mutating. As institutional architecture we associate with a particular period, yes, very much under challenge. And I think that, just to say one more thing, I think that if Trump, and Michelle also mentioned this too, if Trump annexes Greenland, then that's one of the biggest oversteps of dominium, of imperium over dominium that we can imagine. And I think that shatters the rule book in a way. That's not a good metaphor, but it shatters the rules anyway of the 20th century puzzle of global governance. And not in a neoliberal way, by the way. I think in a strikingly old style geoeconomic way. Yeah, it's a really good question. Do you want to take that one?
You start.
I mean, I think it's really a case of us concentrating on different parts of the elephant, so to speak. Because I have to admit that for me, trying to make sense of the United States right now I don't see the producerist strain as being that germane to the language of Trump, actually. I don't know. I see the cutting edge of American even self-understanding of what it means to be a worker.
Can I just make one comment?
Yeah,
on that really
please.
quickly, though? Because if you think about the birth of what I see as kind of the birth of the Trumpist movement on the right in the United States, which was the Tea Party, that the famous Santelli rant was an absolutely producerist rant.
Yeah.
Right? And that's really where the sort of far right,
That's right.
post-Bush, far right version of the Republican Party began that Trump then picked up. And he's captured all those people. So in that sense, I think that they are aligned with what you show.
Yeah, but I mean, it's, if you think about the MAGA coalition, and there is the kind of hard borders Bannon people, there is the Musk, Silicon Valley tech people, and then the smallest member of that coalition is the National Conservatives, I think. I think the Vance, Marco Rubio, Orrin Cass idea of workerism without unions, or like a return of American manufacturing power. I think they're a very junior partner right now in what won the election and what is sort of different and disturbing and new about the Trump coalition to me. I mean, I think that the idea that you have a $500 billion AI infrastructure bill, which is loosely speaking a kind of a proposal that there will be some kind of investment at that level through Larry Ellison, Masayoshi Son, Sam Altman. There wasn't a lot of talk there about producerism, unless I was missing it. I mean, can one interpret the obsession with AI as a producerist impulse? It seems to me like the opposite, but maybe I'm missing something.
No, they're certainly not. But as you said, you have the Tea Party, and then you have Bannon who picks it up. And so that is hardcore producerism for sure. And then you have something else. You have, well, the true libertarians, the fake libertarians like Musk, and you show that very well, the difference between the two. And there it's a different thing. And that's where the dispute that you mentioned between Bannon and Musk, or rather Bannon being jealous because Musk is, the chosen one at this point, and he's pushed aside. And so their dispute was, I mean, it's nothing, and at the same time, it's interesting in the terms. The accusation that is leveled by Bannon is Musk is a techno-feudal guy, and he's a racist. He's racist. That's his main problem, apartheid racist. And why is he a racist? What was the origin of the dispute? Because he's insufficiently xenophobic. In other words, his racism is expressed by the fact that he wants to let, highly skilled East Asian people come in, right? That's how his racism goes. But that's un-American, so therefore he should be expelled too and go back to South Africa. So you have this tension there between, an IQ-based racism, where the super elite could be in a way cosmopolitan. I mean, not totally. Certain cultures are good, right? The East Asian culture and the white culture can breed and produce this sort of super duper IQ strong elite. And that's the people that you want to protect against everything, because it's only when they're totally free that wealth can trickle down. And that's one version, which is not the same as, the old style Bannon version, which is the classical producerist, where it's about producing the nation by cleansing it of all its foreign elements. And it's seen as nationalist and not racist, because to the extent that minorities praise America and the nation, whiteness can be securitized, and sort of you can buy share into whiteness if you're, Latino or even Black. So this is a tension. So you could say, aha, Yeah, it's a big tension. And you could say, aha, this is the beginning of the end. It's cracking. So you can see, the liberal, like the New Republic saying, okay, they're fighting. It's almost the end. But no, that's the great thing about the far right. They are really good at accommodating tensions like that and making sort of creative syntheses in a way where they can play on both. You can, on the one hand, identify in a vicarious way with Musk. Of course, you're not a genius, but by rooting for the genius, you're in a way in the genius camp. You can say that. And on the other hand, you can sort of enjoy the ethnic cleansing pleasure of producerism, because if things go wrong, it's because the parasites there were more of them than we thought, and they were even nastier than we thought, so we have to expel even more of them. So you can play with both things, and, it's operative enough to keep yourself going. And since at the same time that you're doing that, you are destroying, and that's what, what's his name, the budget man, the guy who's the head of the budget, is going to do. You can destroy the administrative state and take over the judiciary. So it's fine. Either you continue to have a slight majority in the next vote, or you'll have the tools then to eliminate vote altogether and to have a true world without democracy. So the two are in tension, but that this tension is going to produce a crack, I'm not so sure.